Joe Hopkins here, and are Chinese guitars any good? And I think they are. Some of them, and some of them aren't. Same as pretty much anywhere else they make guitars, you know? You get some good ones, you get some bad ones. I'm holding my Firefly right here. This is my Firefly FFLP. And the reason why is I think these are going to be collector's items someday. And I'll tell you why. First of all, the previous iterations of these are already being resold on eBay for more than the purchase price. And they're not that old, right? People have been buying these in the last 2 or 3 years and reselling them for more than they bought them for already. And doing it successfully. And what this reminds me of is Japanese guitars in the 80s. If you remember, Ibanez got started doing a lot of copycats, right? Back in the 70s, them and other Japanese guitar companies were seen as cheap knockoffs. And they did, they had those, you can look up lawsuit guitars, because a lot of them got sued because they were literally just making knockoffs of Gibsons and Fenders, usually Gibsons. And they got good at making guitars, right? And eventually they started making their own guitars. Like, nobody looks at Ibanez today and says, man, they're a cheap knockoff company, right? Like they say about the Chinese companies. Ibanez is pretty well respected. In fact, Japanese guitars in general are pretty well respected. And it was the same way with Korea, South Korea, and Indonesia. They were seen as places where companies, like name brand companies, would have their guitars made. Like Epiphone and ESP and some of the other big names would have guitars made in South Korea and Indonesia. And now a lot of them are their own companies. They're making their own guitars. And they're good guitars, right? And they're starting to get some respect. People see South Korean guitars as pretty good. Well, Chinese guitars are heading in that direction. Right now, they're not making like knockoffs. I mean, we remember the Gibsons. They were making Gibson guitars and putting the Gibson name on it, but they're not Gibson. Well, now they've done like a lot of companies before them in other countries, like the Japanese. They've gone to making Gibson and Fender style guitars and putting their own name on the headstock, right? So they're not knockoffs anymore, but they're really affordable. The same way the Japanese guitars were really affordable in the 80s. But I think the Chinese guitars are going to get better, a lot better. You've already seen Harley Benton go from making seriously budget guitars, and they still do, but they've gone from that to making some really good guitars that cost more. Eventually, you're going to see them making premium level guitars at premium prices along with their budget ones. I don't know if they'll ever give up the budget manufacturing, but they're moving in the direction of being a respectable name brand. And I think Firefly eventually might just do the same thing. They might not, who knows? But they make good guitars. This isn't a great guitar, but it's a solidly good guitar. And that's where it starts. They're learning how to make guitars. The same as the Japanese did, and the same as the Koreans did. They're learning how to make solid guitars. And at some point, they're going to be really good guitars. And when I say I think this will be a collector's item, it's the same in the same vein as those early Ibanezes are now vintage collector's items. I think these Firefly guitars and a couple of the other brands will eventually be seen in that light. They'll become premium brands in their own right. And they are good guitars. I mean, nowadays with CNC machines, you don't have somebody actually cutting the body and the neck and everything differently. They're pretty consistent. So once you get it right once, you can get it right every time. You know, where you find the differences with a lot of these Chinese and Asian guitars is in the necks and the fret work. But Firefly seems to be pretty good at that. They've got it down pretty good. Now, they don't do like some companies where they do a setup on it before they send it out to you. And some people kind of struggle with that. They get it and it's not quite right. And, a lot of people don't know how to set up their guitar. I do, so it wasn't that big a deal for me. But you see a lot of companies that are ordering guitars from overseas. They have them made for them, like Xavier, and there are some others, where they do an inspection and a setup at their factory, and ship it out to you. And the only real difference is they did an inspection and a setup a lot of times. Now, Xavier makes particularly good guitars, and they have their own electronics, there's GFS pickups, and that makes a difference. That really does. So you might pay a little bit more, but you're getting a little bit more too. But, you know, these other Chinese brands, they're cheap and they're good. This was $200. My Glary was $100, and they're not bad guitars. This is better than the Glary, way better. The Glary is just a sufficient guitar. It's decent. This is a really good guitar, especially when you get it set up decent. And, you know, it's in good enough shape to set up decent. And if I wanted it to be a lot better, I would change out the pickups and the electronics, and then I'd have like a premium guitar. I mean, it's well built. The guitar itself, body, neck, all that stuff. It's very well constructed. And I think you're going to see these brands going in a more premium direction, some of them, at some point, and they're going to be the name brands of the future. You know what I mean? Everybody starts out as a budget brand before they become a premium brand, right? Yeah, Gibson wasn't a known name once upon a time, neither was Fender. They had to make their way into that. And there are a lot of guitar manufacturers and instrument manufacturers that had to work their way up to being respected. And I think that's what a lot of the Chinese companies are doing, right? I mean, when you look back like 200 years ago, American made really didn't carry the weight it does now. And it takes a little while. You look, like I said, back 40 years ago, Japanese made did not carry weight whatsoever. But now we see Japanese guitars as very good. Fender makes some of their guitars in Mexico, and a lot of people prefer the American, but I've played both, and the Mexican ones are fine. They're excellent guitars. And there are other guitars that are made in Mexico that are perfectly fine. And keep in mind, I mean, Mexico, right? They're Spanish. That's where the guitar really got its legs. That's where it originated, in Spain. The Spanish people should be pretty good at making guitars, and they are. They are. You play a Mexican Fender and an American Fender, tell me if you can tell the difference, right? Because I personally can't. Maybe somebody more of an expert than me can. But Chinese guitars, I think if you took a guitar like this Firefly, put a little bit, you know, upgraded the electronics and some of the hardware, like the tuners and the bridge. Well, the bridge is fine, but the tuners. And put a decent setup on it. As far as the actual construction of the guitar, I think you could pass it off for a premium brand. I think you could put Gibson on the headstock and people wouldn't know any different. That's just my opinion. But that means that they can go in a more premium direction, and I think they will. So, I mean, really, if you got a couple $100, if you got $200, buy a Firefly. And I mentioned Firefly because I really think they're the ones heading in, that have the option to head in that premium direction, especially since, like I said, they're already becoming kind of collector's items because they change the look of the guitars, they change the finishes every so often. So the older ones become something that they're not making currently. So, you know, I mean, if they become a really big name someday, I'm sure they'll have reissues like Gibson and Fender do. But these originals, I think they'll be worth some money someday. I think they'll be considered like vintage guitars. I mean, I used to own a Maserite, and back Sammy Mosley, when he was making those Maserite guitars back in the 60s, it was not a big respected brand, especially not at first, and it didn't last, right? They went out of business sometime in the 70s, I guess. But those guitars are worth a lot of money now, right? Because people they learn to dig them. And I think people will do the same with these Fireflies, like they did with Ibanez. I had an 80s Ibanez, like an 85 or 86 Pro Line V, and that's, I wish I hadn't sold it, or I wish I hadn't sold the Maserite either. Both of those guitars are worth a good bit now, because even though they were budget at the time, they got respect over time. So brands like Firefly and Harley Benton will, I think, eventually be premium brands. But are they any good right now? Yes, they are. You have some Chinese guitars like the Glaries that are just sufficient. But for $100, sufficient's good enough. And then you have brands, like I said, like Firefly and whatnot, that are solidly good guitars. And I think they're going to go up in value, and I think they're going to get better at making them. And at some point, they're going to make better, more expensive guitars with better electronics. Right now, they're $200 a piece. Who knows what it'll be in the future, right? I mean, Harley Benton's most expensive guitar was like $200 or $300, and now they're selling guitars that are $700, $800, and people buy them because they are that good now. So hey, are they that good? Yes. And will they get better? Probably. A certain number of those brands are going to get better, and they're going to expand. So that's just my little rant on it. Those are my thoughts. I love you guys. I'll see you in the next video. Peace out, baby. Bye-bye.